Hi, everyone. I'm Judy Krasna, and I'm the Executive Director of F.E.A.S.T. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before I introduce Dr. Kaye, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please keep your camera and microphone off at all times. If you have a question for Dr. Kaye, please write it in the chat box, and we will get to as many questions as time allows. F.E.A.S.T. relies on donations to run programs like this webinar. If you would like to support F.E.A.S.T. so that we can continue offering educational programming to the parent community, you can find a link to our donations page in the chat box. And now it is truly an honor to welcome Dr. Walter Kaye. Dr. Kaye is the founder and executive director of the UCSD Eating Disorder Treatment and Research Program. His current research is focused on exploring the relationship between brain and behavior using brain imaging and genetics, and developing and applying new treatments for anorexia and bulimia nervosa. Dr. Kaye is a giant in the eating disorders field. He is a giant not only due to his brilliant mind, his impressive academic achievements, and his extraordinary clinical skills. He's a giant because in addition to all of that, he is a warm, kind, giving, empathetic person who is always so generous with his time and with his knowledge. We are blessed to have Dr. Kaye as one of our F.E.A.S.T. advisors and so grateful to have him here with us today. Dr. Kaye.
Judy, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. And I'm delighted to be able to speak with F.E.A.S.T. today. You know, we've always considered F.E.A.S.T. a really important organization in the field, and we're delighted to work with you. It's so important that we involve families. So I'm going to talk today about anxiety and harm avoidance and how we're understanding how it impacts restricted eating, and more important than that, what are the clinical implications for this? So let me just kind of say a couple things about this. One is we're taking a somewhat different approach, I think, than many programs do in the field. We're asking the question of, you know, we don't have great treatments for anorexia, and we're asking the question of how do certain circuits work in the brain normally, and what might be different about them in people with anorexia nervosa, rather than coming up with some kind of a priori hypothesis about what causes anorexia. The other thing is that over the last 10, 15 years, we've really developed some very powerful ways of actually looking at the brain and health in living human beings. And, you know, we haven't had these kind of tools in the past, so our knowledge about brain function has been very kind of primitive, but we really are learning now a lot about how the brain works, or maybe different in people with anorexia. And I'm going to talk particularly about anxiety and a concept called harm avoidance and how that impacts restricted eating in our clinical applications. So, as you well know, there are some puzzling symptoms in anorexia. It has a certain age of onset, tends to occur more commonly in women, and of course, severe restricted eating and emaciation. But despite that, people are preoccupied with food. And they tend to be excellent students, but they have limited ability to learn to change. And how do you kind of understand these symptoms? And they have body image distortions and fear of being fat. And the course of anorexia, you know, in the long run, there's a lot of people that recover, but it's not unusual that it may take 5 or 10 or more years before people get better. Still, we have a group of people that remain chronically ill or may even die from anorexia. So why do people with anorexia often see if we can require a higher level of care and sometimes die? You know, there's no proven treatments that normalize eating and weight. They're often very resistant to engaging in treatment. They have a lack of motivation. And we think that anxiety plays a major role in restricted eating and this lack of motivation. And we know that there's powerful contributions to genetics and altered brain processes. And let me try and explain not just the circuits, but actually the function of these circuits and what may be different in people with anorexia. So, you know, many women in our culture diet, but relatively few develop an eating disorder. And you would think that if it was just psychosocial in nature, that it would be a much more common disorder. So it really raises the question, are there susceptibility factors that make some people vulnerable to dieting and weight loss? So I imagine many of you have children with eating disorders. And let me ask you this question, which is, as a child, before your child ever developed an eating disorder, did they have these kinds of traits? Were they achievement oriented? Did they want to get all A's? Were they perfectionistic as children? Again, before the onset of eating disorder, were they children that tend to be sensitive to criticism or punishments or mistakes? Were they anxious kids? Did they worry about what might happen? Were they harm or risk avoidant? They have difficulty with uncertainty, novelty, change, social situations. Were they obsessional, particularly about things just being a certain way? Did they have disturbances of body weight? Did textures bother them? Did they have a lot of stomach pain? Did they have problems with being touched? And some of them may be very impulsive and overreactive and emotional. Now, what we find is that people that develop eating disorders as children tend to have some of these traits. And it's not like everybody has all of them, and people have different patterns. But most of the time, there's one or more of these traits that occur in childhood. And anxiety is also a symptom of this disorder. Um, Heather Hauer, who's a researcher that we work with, who's recovered from anorexia, described it as being constantly on red level high alert. She described it as there was no distinction in her mind between events that were just that could be life-threatening or just kind of annoying. And she reacted as everything was a real crisis. And her anxiety influenced her eating behavior. She discovered that when she restricted food intake, she felt less anxious overall. And she describes herself as being highly anticipatory in terms of anxiety and expected the worst to happen. So we know that many people with anorexia and actually many of their relatives have anxiety disorders. And there's data that suggests that having high anxiety is associated with, lower weight and greater caloric restriction, a greater eating disorder psychopathology, and worse outcome. And interestingly enough, despite being anxious, people with anorexia don't tend to respond to benzodiazepines, which are often a drug that helps other people with anxiety disorders. And we've actually think that there may be a gene involved in this. Benzodiazepines act on one of the neurotransmitters, GABA, and people with anorexia may have a higher rate of a certain GABA gene that makes them insensitive to benzodiazepines. So what about anxiety disorders? Well, this is a series of studies that were done over the last 20, 25 years. The DEEP study was done in Pittsburgh, the Bulick study in New Zealand, the Goddard study in France, and our study was done in the United States and Canada and Europe. And what we did is we asked the question of how many people had a lifetime anxiety disorder. You can see actually whether people had anorexia, bulimia, that the rates were pretty constant, that, somewhere between 60 and 80% of people have a lifetime anxiety disorder, no surprise. What was interesting about this, again, look how consistent this is. If you ask the question, what came first, the anxiety disorder or the eating disorder, very consistently, what we saw here, about 60% of the time, people had anxiety disorder first in childhood and then developed an eating disorder later. And our sample was large enough to actually ask the question of what kind of anxiety disorders, and the most common was obsessive compulsive disorder, and the second most common was social phobia. Now, another study that we did to ask the question of anxiety disorders, and we want to know whether, having an eating disorder made you more anxious, but that the anxiety went away after you recovered. So we asked the question, we did a very large study with almost 700 women with the eating disorder and 700 healthy control women, and we divided them into 4 categories, and that is, were people currently ill with an eating disorder or had they recovered? And did they have a lifetime history of an anxiety disorder or not? And the bottom line is right here. And that is that if you would recover from an eating disorder and you never had a lifetime anxiety disorder, you actually still were more anxious, either a state or trait anxiety, than the healthy control women here, or you had elevated harm avoidance, which I'm going to concentrate on a bit in this talk, which is a measure of a combination of anxiety and inhibition and inflexibility. So this actually says the bottom line is that this is perhaps a trait that exists before you develop an eating disorder and persists even in people who have good outcomes. They have mild to moderate anxiety and risk avoidance, harm avoidance. So what's different about eating behavior and anorexia? And this is kind of, I'm not trying to be facetious, but there's a game show in American TV called uh, Family Feud. And what they do is two families compete against each other, and the producers ask a question, and they say, how common is some certain event? And the families have to guess how common that event is. And the reason I show this, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this, is that people that come in for treatment with anxiety disorder often are in the middle of a family feud, but it's really between them and their parents. Because they don't want to eat, they don't want to gain weight, and it's very, very frustrating and stressful for families to deal with this, because there doesn't seem to be anything they can do to get their kids to eat and gain weight very easily. So one of the things that we ask the question of is what do people like when they don't have an eating disorder? How do you feel when you go without eating for a day or two? And there's a literature on this, and I would say 95% of the time, people don't have an eating disorder will answer this way. And the question is, so how do you feel when you go without eating for a day or two? And what most people will say, it's uncomfortable. They feel irritable, tense. It just doesn't feel good. And how do you feel when you eat? Well, when you get hungry enough, eating becomes kind of more rewarding. That first bite of food tastes really good, and there's pleasure and reward when eating, especially when you're hungry. What about people with anorexia nervosa? And there's a pretty strong literature on this. And what people with anorexia will often tell you is exactly the opposite. There's something about food or thinking about food that's uncomfortable and anxiety producing. And they will say that if they don't eat, they feel better. Either because the anxiety doesn't get worse, or for some people, then anorexia, it's even kind of empowering and rewarding. And so that's very interesting. And the question is, does anxiety contribute to a disturbance of appetite regulation in people with anorexia? And how can we understand that? So let me kind of talk about animals here for the next 5 or 10 minutes, and talk about what we've learned about the physiology of animal behavior and how that relates to humans. If you're an animal like a rabbit, you can go out and provide for yourself. You can find food, you eat, you reproduce. Um, but it's very safe for a rabbit to stay, in its hole in the ground. And what happens is that when rabbits get hungry, they have decreased energy stores in their body. Their stores of sugar and even fats, if they get hungry enough, begin to diminish. And actually, that sends various signals to their brain that motivate them to go out and eat and look for food. Now, for a rabbit, um, living in the wild, rabbits don't live very long. They actually, their life in the wild is about a year and a half, where in captivity they'll live 8 or 9 years. And, there's predators out there that may eat that rabbit. And so a rabbit has to be able to not only look for food and find food, but it has to avoid being eaten by predators. And so that's built into, our very primitive brain. Now, let me talk a little bit about the brain and the difference between animals and humans. And this may get a little bit complicated, but what does the brain do? How does the rabbit stay alive? Well, it needs to make appropriate decisions to satisfy its needs, like food, reproduction, navigate the world, and not get eaten by predators. And part of this is sensing and learning from things that are rewarding and things that are risking, so that they can find food and stay alive and pass on their genes. Now, as it turns out, these systems in rabbits or rats that are very important for doing that are actually quite identical with humans. And what's the way our brain has developed is that there's kind of very simplistically two parts of the brain. There's a part of the brain that's below the cortex, the cerebral cortex, which is unique in humans, and these subcortical regions, and that are pretty identical actually with lower animals. What's really different about human beings is that we have a very large cortex. And this cortex is very important for like memory and language, reading and writing, abstract thinking. But these primitive kind of processes like finding food and learning from risk and reward and um, and avoiding predators are actually built into the subcortical region that we share with animals. And so that's the area that we've really been looking at in people with anorexia, is asking questions about, is there something different about these primitive systems? So what we know is that here's the subcortical region in the people's brains with anorexia nervosa. And this is the architecture, the circuits in this brain. And this is a very important neurocircuitry that actually translates taste and other kinds of rewards into motivated eating behavior. And it mediates and regulates goal-directed behaviors such as the consumption, finding, and the consumption of palatable food. And I'm going to talk about certain areas of this and just a little bit about what they do. I'm going to talk about the insula, which is very important for kind of uh, basic drives in the body. And I'll talk more about that. And also in a part of the brain called the striatum that the insula connects with and actually allows us to make selections, to motivate us to carry out behavior and make selections. And what's different about that with people with anorexia nervosa. So how do animals find food and avoid being food? Well, the first thing that you need to know about animals as well as human beings is that they have to kind of handle a lot of different information. And so they're getting these signals from their body about deficit or surplus of energy. And so there's a part of the brain, the hypothalamus, that communicates with these centers that I'm going to talk about in terms of motivating and selecting actions and carrying them out. And they get messages about how hungry they are. There's also other kind of body states that you're getting messages about, the taste of food, touch, visceral muscle sensations, hunger, reproduction. If you have a pain in your stomach, that may inhibit your eating behavior. If you're if you've got to have a bowel movement, or there's a predator out there, you're going to have to, maybe concentrate on that. And so there's other parts of the brain that are very important for looking at the external world and what's risky and rewarding, and how that may interfere with hunger. So you're processing all these different kind of messages, and you have to make a decision about them. So to go back to the insula has a portion of the brain that's actually a taste cortex. And what it does is when you taste something like sugar, that sugar molecule fits into a receptor on your tongue and sends through wiring that goes up through your brainstem into your insula. It actually tells you you've tasted something sweet. And that integrates with other kind of body states that you may be aware of, touch, temperature, uh, reproduction, other kinds of things that are going on, homeostatic states that are going on, to really kind of make a decision about what's you're going to concentrate on and what's important with. And also these other messages you're getting about energy stores in your body, how much fat and carbohydrate you have, and the messengers that communicate with the body, like leptin and insulin, about your energy stores. All this is getting integrated into the insula, and what it's doing is it puts an emotion and evaluation on that with other parts of the brain. It tells you kind of what's important. What do you want to really concentrate on? Are you going to concentrate on eating food? Or are you going to concentrate on that predator that might be out there? Or are you going to concentrate on reproduction? You have to make a decision about that. And what it does is all this information funnels through a part of the brain that we share with animals called the striatum. And what this part of the brain does is it actually allows you to kind of make a choice. You can't do everything at once. You can only do really one thing at a time. Actually, if you try and do too many things at once and you can't really integrate them, that really, often people have a behavioral disturbance. And so what the striatum does is it allows you to focus your attention and do one single thing and inhibit other kinds of events or processes that you might engage in so that you just can choose one thing. And what it does, and I'll explain to you a little bit more here, is that, animals and people learn from reward and punishment. So if something is rewarding, like food, you learn to do it more. If something is punishing, you learn to do it less. And you learn from this and by experiencing the event. And then what you do is you then learn to, it doesn't make a lot, you don't want to learn from everything, over and over again. You learn to anticipate when that event may happen and whether it might be rewarding or punishing if you get cues that it may happen again. And you update your decision making based on comparing what you think is going to happen with what actually happens. So what's an example of this? And you just develop strategies to minimize risk and, and carry out this kind of behavior. So how does the striatum learn from reward and punishment? Well, the striatum is consisted of three different parts that work together in concert. There's a part of it that evaluates the reward and risk. Is this really rewarding? Is this really risky to me? What have I learned in the past? And it allows you to carry out some kind of selection, initiate one action and inhibit other kinds of actions. And you carry out a motor activity to do that. Now, what's an example? This seems kind of very kind of like, how do you learn from that? And, this is actually kind of an unconscious process. You're doing this all the time and you're not really aware of that. How does that make sense? Well, almost everybody has learned to ride a bicycle. This is actually a good example of how the striatum works. And, I ask people all the time, explain to me how you learn to ride a bicycle. And they go like, well, you just kind of get on it and you try it and eventually you learn how to ride it. So what happens is this is a great example of learning from reward and punishment. So when you get on the bicycle that first time, what you want to do is you want to stay upright and you don't want to fall over. And of course, what's going to happen is you're going to fall over. You start to, ride the bicycle, but you don't know how to balance, and so you fall to one side. So the next time you try it, your brain says to itself, that was punishing. You fell over. Next time you start to fall, I'm going to kind of, why don't you shift your weight to the other side? And of course, you do that and you fall the other way. And then gradually over time, what you begin to learn is that, falling is punishing, staying on the bike is rewarding, and your brain begins to kind of very, finally kind of shift your weight more precisely. So eventually you learn to just kind of balance on that bicycle and you're getting rewarded and you're not getting punished. And so what you're doing is you're having this circuit here where the outcome actually informs your action selection and your motivation, and you update that and you learn to stay on the bike. And so, and you do this really kind of unconsciously, and we process a lot of information every day, including social cues and dealing with other kinds of people and eating that really encompass this kind of unconscious kind of behaviors. And there's evidence that suggests that people with anorexia, because this is a balance between reward and risk, actually have an imbalance in these systems. They tend to have decreased reward and motivation. They underconsume food, drugs, money. They diminish reward sensitivity. And maybe this denial, lack of motivation, engaged in treatment has something to do with lacking, this ability to kind of, incorporate rewards. But they tend to be anxious and inhibited. They are highly sensitive to punishment, things going wrong. They tend to be risk and harm avoidant. They tend to be over concerned with consequences, and they're intolerant of uncertainty and novelty. So there may be some kind of imbalance built in to the sensitivity of the wiring of these systems. So what do we know about hunger? Well, what hunger does, it increases the motivational aspect of food and money. And so it activates these regions associated with reward and motivation, and it reduces top-down inhibitory self-control. Things just don't seem as risky. So when people are hungry, healthy humans are actually less risk averse. And we know for a long time, if you starved animals, they are actually more sensitive to drugs of abuse. And now this makes sense because this reward circuit gets kind of turned on, and drugs of abuse tend to act on this reward circuit. And my mother used to say, if you're hungry, don't go, you go shopping. You're liable to buy things that are unhealthy and high caloric and more palatable, because this reward circuit is turned on. So the question is, do people with anorexia have an abnormal response to hunger? So we published a study last year in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and these are my collaborators that looked at this issue. And what we did is we had people with anorexia come into a research building on campus, and we did the study twice. Now, one day we had them fast for 16 hours, so they were pretty hungry, and the other day we had them eat normally. And they came in and our research center, and they laid in a brain scanner, and we put a tube in their mouth when we fed them repeated taste of sugar, because that activates the circuit that I'm talking about. And we want to see how they responded on the day they were hungry compared to the day that they were fasted. And so the question is, people with anorexia, you get down to 60 or 70 pounds, you should be very hungry. You should be getting all kinds of messages that you're hungry. Why aren't you eating? Why aren't you responding to those signals? The other thing that we did here is we looked at people who were recovered from anorexia, normal weight, nutrition, menses, not on medication. And the reason that we did this is that we figured if we study people that were very underweight with anorexia, there would be abnormalities of the circuit, but we wouldn't be able to tease apart cause and effect. And so we reasoned that if people recover from anorexia, and this is really a trait, it would persist even in the recovered state. And so this is women in their 20s. The CW is control women. The RAN is recovered and remitted anorexics. These are people in their 20s at normal BMI. And you can see that, like I've discussed before, even after recovery, people with anorexia tended to be mild to moderately anxious and harm avoidant. And we asked people with anorexia and the control women, if they could tell that they were hungry or when they were starved, and did that look any different? And interestingly enough, the people who recover from anorexia and the control women look very similar in terms of their self-ratings of being hungry or thirsty. So here's the bottom line. Let me spend a little bit of time on it. The primary finding was in this part of the striatum that's very important for motivation, for getting you to do something, selecting something and carrying that out. And what we found is, this is the control women, and it's called the ventral caudal putamen. And what we found is, in the day that the control women were hungry, they had higher activity in this motivational part of the striatum than the day that they were fed. Not a surprise. That's what we expected to find. That's what other investigators have found. What about people with anorexia? Well, the finding was that people with anorexia had, when on the day they were hungry, had diminished activity in this motivational circuit compared to the control women or compared to themselves when they were fed. Actually, when they were fed, the anorexics and the control women looked identical. There wasn't a difference. It was only on the day that they were hungry. They just are not responding to diminished food intake and hunger signals the way healthy control women do. And I think this is really an important finding, because it's actually suggesting that there may be something different about the brain of people with anorexia nervosa. Now, we also looked at the insula. This part of the brain is very important for kind of integrating emotions and homeostatic drives with this motivational part of the brain. This is actually a circuit. These parts of the brain connect together, and you can measure kind of the activity of this connection of the part of the brain. And we found exactly the same kind of thing. Then the day that people with anorexia were hungry, they had decreased signal in this circuitry that connects, signals about emotion and homeostatic drives with motivation. And they looked identical to the healthy controls on the day that they were fed. Now, there's another study that's recently been published that has a similar kind of finding, and this came out of Germany. And this was done a bit differently, and this was done in people that were underweight with anorexia nervosa. And what they did is this was on the day that they were hungry, and they fed people with anorexia either water or water with sugar in it. And so these are people that are, underweight. They're going to have decreased energy stores, and they should be sending signals through these neurotransmitters you've heard about, like insulin, leptin, and a number of other signals from the body that go to the part of the brain called the hypothalamus that connect with the anterior insulin, the limbic striatum, that really tell you about diminished food stores and motivate you to eat. What happened in the control women when they were fed sugar, that increased the signal to this motivation region. But similar to what we saw in people with anorexia, sugar failed to change the signal in this motivational region. So again, this is a bit of evidence that there's something about this motivational circuit that's not getting turned on. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think that's still open to interpretation. And also the other thing is different people with anorexia may have alterations in parts of this circuit. There may be a group of people with anorexia that fail to sense body state signals or hunger or accurately integrate that with emotions of drive. There may be other people that have impaired motivation or initiation response when they're hungry. But there's something going on within the circuit of people with anorexia nervosa. Now, how does sensitivity to anxiety and risk interfere with eating? One of the other findings that we had is in this part of the striatum that's very important for action selection, making a choice about something and carrying out that choice, thinking about the consequences of that and carrying out the choice of it. What we found is that part of the brain, the more harm avoidant you were, the lower the signal going through that part of the brain. And that's a very interesting kind of finding, because we've actually seen a relationship between anxiety or harm avoidance and this specific part of the striatum now in about 6 different studies. And so I can tell you for behavioral disorder, this is a very powerful finding, and we found it on both sides of the brain. Now, what do we know about the striatum? Well, one of the major neurotransmitters for the striatum is a transmitter called dopamine. And people think of dopamine as being a reward neurotransmitter. That's not really what it does. What it actually does is just what I told you. It actually helps you learn from reward and reward predicting stimuli and code that in your brain. And it actually helps you with kind of learning and economic decision making about what you're going to do or what choices you're going to make, because this is what this part of the brain does, is to help you make certain choices and inhibit other kinds of choices. And we know that people with anorexia nervosa have disturbances of dopamine metabolism, and that's been shown in several different kinds of studies. And so how is high anxiety and inhibition associated with a reduced eating action in this part of the brain? Well, this gets a little tricky to understand, but dopamine is this major neurotransmitter. It's very important for decision making. And we know that people with anorexia have reduced brain dopamine, altered dopamine receptors. And if you dopamine deplete a mouse, they don't eat. And you could actually restore that by putting dopamine into this action part of the brain, actually not the motivational part of the brain, and that will enable mice to eat. And what this does is it enables animals to orientate their attention towards food consumption in response to metabolic demand. And another way of saying this is a very important, because this is very important for action selection, this is actually very important for initiating eating behavior. And there's another disorder that affects the striatum called Parkinson's disease. And in Parkinson's disease, the dopamine neurons die, and people with Parkinson's disease aren't able to initiate motor activity. And they're frozen. And so they may be sitting there and you ask them to stand up and they say, well, I want to stand up. I just can't initiate that action. And this may be a comparable process going on in people with anorexia where they can't actually initiate eating, approaching a food, eating food. Now, we did another study in another group of people with anorexia that really kind of, I think, bring home how this part of the brain is involved with anorexia. So another way of looking at this, and another kind of imaging study we can do, is we can give people a dose of amphetamine. Now, the way amphetamine works is it releases a lot of dopamine in the brain. And there are ways to do imaging studies that actually allow you to measure how much dopamine is being released in the brain and what that does to people's behavior. And what we found is in the control women, the more dopamine that they released in the brain, in this part of the brain that's very important for motivation, the more euphoric they felt, the better they felt. Not surprising, people like amphetamine, methamphetamine, things like that, it usually makes them feel pretty good. But what we found in people with anorexia is the more dopamine they released in this part of the brain that's very important for action selection, the more anxious they became. And this is the part of the brain that we've found anxiety and harm avoidance to be associated with this part of the brain. And so there's something very different about the wiring of people with anorexia nervosa. They don't respond in a reward way. They're responding anxiously. And when you eat a little bit of food, it releases dopamine. And if you're going to be releasing dopamine and it makes you feel anxious, it makes a lot of sense that you're not going to eat. It's not pleasant. So in summary, harm avoidance is associated with a reduced signal to this action part of the brain. It may be that anxiety is interfering with the throughput of this part of the brain, these messages that we're getting about action selection. And my guess is what's going on is that there's impaired initiation of eating behavior, or there could be just inhibition of eating behavior. So one of the reasons I talk about this is, are there treatments for this? Well, we and other investigators have been investigating drugs that work on dopamine, and one of them is called Aripiprazole or Abilify. And this is a drug that is it's called an atypical antipsychotic. We don't think that people with anorexia are psychotic, but it's unfortunate because these drugs tend to get named by the first disorder it treats. But this drug does act pretty specifically on the dopamine system, and there's several studies now, open trials, that suggest that it reduces the stress around eating. Abilify and SSRI together may actually work better than another one of these drugs, olanzapine and SSRI or SRI alone, in reducing anxiety and depression and core eating disorder symptoms. Aripiprazole may work better than treatment as usual in terms of weight gain. These are all open trials. I'm not proposing this as a magic bullet. What we find is it may work fairly effectively in a subgroup of people with anorexia, and it doesn't work in other people with anorexia. But it's certainly something to consider. There's a related drug which is called olanzapine or Zyprexa, which works more or less kind of the same in the brain. There was a paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry several years ago in an outpatient study of anorexia suggesting that olanzapine works better than placebo in terms of improving weight gain in people with anorexia. So I think we're starting to turn the corner and understanding these systems that are involved and coming up with better kind of treatment approaches. So in summary, what I would suggest that people with anorexia have this sensitivity in this part of the brain where they're much more sensitive to risk than reward. And that's why you're seeing these premorbid kinds of traits about not making mistakes, about, getting things right, about being sensitive to punishment and criticism. And because this part of the brain is has a bias towards kind of being responsive to punishment and aversive signals and less responsive to reward. And because of that, people may be getting a signal actually about food. That there's something about food that actually is kind of aversive. Now, the rest of us don't have this kind of signal, but if your brain is oversensitive to kind of aversive signals, you may be miscoding signals about food as being kind of aversive. So for people with anorexia, food may not be motivated or rewarding. They just may be miscoding food as risky, and they're getting signals, and no wonder they're anxious about eating because their brain is kind of giving them a different message about food. Is there a benefit to this? Well, this is very important to kind of consider. Our ancestors lived in a dangerous world. And, if you were living 50,000 years ago, and you were the person, that really worried about, you had this bias, this sensitivity, you were worried about what might go wrong and what might kill you. You were less concerned with reward. You're the person sitting around your tribe worrying about, oh, something might happen. You've got plans, you got a repertoire of plans that might happen, how to deal with it. This is self-protective. Mother Nature doesn't really care that you're happy. Mother Nature cares that you stay alive and you pass on your genes. And so, there may be a benefit, especially, in very dangerous kind of times, to have this kind of behaviors. People with anorexia can't really turn this off. They can do diversions like schoolwork and exercise, but it doesn't make this go away. So one of the things that, but people with anorexia do get better. And we begin to wonder whether, they come up with constructive coping strategies. So for example, one of the things that people with anorexia tell us, here's this problem, this doesn't go away when people recover in terms of lack of motivation to eat. But some people with anorexia say, I realize that, I'm not going to get signals that tell me how much to eat every day. So, I'm just put myself on a schedule. I know I have to eat a certain amount of calories every day. And to maintain my weight, I'm going to eat the same thing every day. And, at least that will keep me out of treatment and keep me functioning and keep me at a healthy body weight. And so this also, may be a competitive advantage in certain professions. People with anorexia have certain traits that may be very beneficial. They're achievement-oriented, they pay attention to details, they're concerned about consequences, they're self-disciplined. What we're seeing is a lot of people with anorexia actually do very well in certain professions that reward these kind of traits. Engineering, law, finance, research, medicine. So that, when people start to recover, they actually may be able to use these traits in beneficial kinds of ways. So in summary, this anxiety and inhibition may be premorbid traits that persist after recovery and develop a vulnerability for developing anorexia, but maybe miscoding food is risky. And, how does this show itself clinically? Well, this is a group of people where their anxiety is really, they're going to be anxious anyway, and it's exacerbated by change and uncertainty. And this may have a lot to do with why it's so hard to get people with anorexia to engage in treatment. They have this high level of quiet anxiety, intense over worry about consequences, plans, exactness, making mistakes. This may not be apparent to families or clinicians. They may act so they're calmer than they are, but when they're put in new and uncertain situations like entering treatment, they may just be flooded by this intolerable anxiety, and they really may want to flee, and they tend to get more rigid and resistant. And they have difficulty in changing their mental state. Part of this, again, is updating, what you know about reward and what you think you know about reward and punishing events based on new evidence about what's happening out there in the world. And, you're constantly kind of updating your assumptions. And people with anorexia may have a hard time doing this because they're so anxious all the time. It's difficult for new information to get in. And they may be playing the same track over and over again. And, we tell our staff, don't obsess with the patient. It's better to help them advance the needle, change the set, rather than just get into kind of obsessive, obsessing with them about something. And they're often grateful, and this diminishes the anxiety. What reduces the anxiety? For anorexic, starvation or exercise and schoolwork. For bulimics, overeating, and really not much else. And again, entering treatment is certain to maximize this anxiety, and they have this tendency to flee. And unfortunately, caring, support, nurturing has limited efficacy, but they do respond to high structure, fewer choices, clear expectations, and not immediately, but gradually over time, because they really have a hard time with change. And so, if things don't change very much, that really is helpful for them, and putting them on medication if they have very high anxiety. As I'm sure you know, there's no evidence that pathological families cause eating disorders. And in fact, eating disorder patients at best are somewhere between ambivalence and resistant hostility about treatment. It's often only the family is motivated. The families are known, they're familiar, and this is a long-term illness. And so it's so very important to work with families and have them learn about these traits and be able to understand and manage their children once they go home. So what about innovative therapy approaches? What I've done here is psychoeducation. It destigmatizes, it explains mechanisms, and it may be very helpful for families. And it's not that helpful for people with anorexia. It's not making the uncomfortable anxiety and other mood states go away. And so medication, is one way, to help reduce some of the anxiety. And the other thing that we've been working on is constructive coping strategies, with the idea that, in a way, when you have these kinds of traits, it may be very hard to change these kind of traits. How can you use them in positive kinds of ways? So we've kind of moved on from trying to change these traits, which we don't think you can do very well, to actually getting people with anorexia to start to manage these traits in more effective kinds of ways, understand that they have them, to use the positive aspects of them, and come up with constructive coping strategies and skills for managing these kinds of traits. And I've been working with my collaborators, doctors Nats Peck, Hill, Town, and Weinrega, on this. And actually, we're going to be launching, probably, hopefully in the next couple of months, a number, a website that people will be able to get on, that's going to have videos and other instruction on ways to kind of help people with anorexia manage these temperament kinds of traits. So, the problem is that they have difficulty, for example, learning from reward and punishment, and this is probably below consciousness. They're getting these messages that things are highly risky, that they're very anxious about things. It's interfering with their motivation and decision making. And what do people with anorexia do? And the walls of our offices are filled with sayings. And what people with anorexia are trying to do is they're trying to tell themselves how to act in a certain situation, because they're not really learning from experience very well. But their cortex is working well, and this is why they do so well in school, because they can learn very well in terms of cortical kind of processing, memorizing, and directing behavior. But actually, intuitively learning is, from reward and punishment, is very hard for them to do. So they give themselves various kinds of messages about how to live life. And so we're using this to actually come up with compensatory skills and strategies. There's a long history of doing this. If you're blind, we're not going to create, there's not anything that we can do to reverse blindness. For example, well, people can learn constructive coping strategies, or learning disabilities. Same thing, people can use other parts of their brain to learn constructive coping strategies. And so we're trying to do that now. For example, a construct of being undersensitive to reward, oversensitive to punishment. People with anorexia tend to be focus on the negative outcomes of doing something. They don't want to do it wrong. And so we can help people with anorexia use that to contract, to eat, maintain their weight by formulating consequences based on, some kind of, we don't want to punish people, but some kind of agreed upon punishment if they don't carry on a certain activity. People have a hard time with change and uncertainty, and so developing parenting skills as well as patient innovations to manage anxiety by high structure and predictability, as well as redirecting and distraction are ways to try and that we find that works on that. And the restricted eating behavior is harder, but one of the things this says to us is that people with anorexia really can't intuitively eat. And so asking them to kind of intuitively pick their food choices is really problematic for them. And that, we need to kind of focus on maybe interventions that enhance initiation of eating and maybe put people on prescribed food and eating a certain amount every day rather than expect people to eat intuitively. So I'm just going to end here by kind of talking about, as we begin to understand what we think is the foundation of these kind of behaviors, how the brain works differently in people with anorexia, this is opening the door now to new kind of approaches. Can we help people improve skills for awareness of their body states and insight into their behavior? Can we help them better identify and modulate their emotions? Can we develop techniques to increase motivation and decrease resistance? Can we develop methods to help initiate eating or reduce anxiety and inhibition? And can we develop better medications that reduce the anxiety? So I just want to, there's a lot of information to throw at you, and we have some time for questions, but I also want to acknowledge and thank all my collaborators that I've worked with over the years that have done a lot of the heavy lifting in developing the data that I've presented to you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaye. We have a little bit of time, so I'm just going to shoot you a few questions. Someone wrote that they're interested in those with anorexia and ADHD who both experience dopamine neurotransmitter issues. Is there any research on those with these comorbid conditions, since they may have a similar factor that helps maintain both?
I'm sorry, I was trying to switch my screen here. Could you just read that quickly again?
Yes, sure. She was asking about anorexia and ADHD, that they both experience dopamine neurotransmitter issues. And she wanted to know whether there was research on those with these comorbid conditions, since they might have a similar factor that helps maintain both.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right that, the same system may be involved in terms of, selection and initiation and selection of, behaviors, maybe in somewhat similar ways, maybe in somewhat different ways. And it's a good question about, what dopamine related medications may help and whether there's a role for stimulants as well as these other, atypical antipsychotic drugs in people with anorexia. I think one of the things that we're learning here is it's not a disorder with one cause. You may have 100 people with anorexia, and there may be 100 different ways to disturb this system that I'm talking about, and that some people with anorexia may respond to one type of drug, others may respond to another. And that's going to be the challenge for the future. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, next question. Does sharing the scientific information help people with anorexia better understand their challenges and fight their anorexia? Should this information be shared openly with the patient, particularly a teen? Will it increase motivation, or is it likely to make someone feel that they're more fated to suffer their disease?
That's also a great question, and I don't have a great answer. I have to tell you that I think it cuts both ways. Sometimes it's very helpful for people with anorexia, and sometimes it makes them feel hopeless and like, oh, I can't change. And I think you have to get them to look at the long term, which is most people with anorexia get a great deal better or partially better, and they learn to develop strategies to cope with these kinds of traits. But it is kind of a different way to look at this. And we have a group of people that are so sensitive to criticism and things going wrong that often, they may misinterpret the real meaning of this data. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do in this series as we try and develop better, explain these traits and new behavioral interventions.
Okay, thank you. We're just going to take one or two more questions. We have two questions actually about ADHD and concurrent anorexia. One person wanted to ask if there was harm with the administration of amphetamines for ADHD and anorexia. And another question, which is related, was whether you have a recommendation for medication for teens that have ADHD and anorexia.
You're asking questions we're wrestling with also. And, I have to tell you, I like being data driven. And, and having some data that really kind of answers these questions. We've been, at least in the United States, it's not easy to put people on amphetamines, and you have to have very clear indications for that. And also, there's some evidence from the studies I've showed you that amphetamines may make some people with anorexia even feel more anxious. So I think we have to, approach this very, very carefully and really do some very clear research and gather data to know whether there's a group of people that actually might benefit from amphetamines and people with anorexia. I mean, we certainly have had some people come in that have been on both, and they say it's helpful for them, but it's, as we're beginning to understand the brain better, this is opening the door to kind of new thinking about treatment.
Great, thank you. Okay. I'm just going to ask one more question because we are running out of time. It's a very basic practical question. You discussed TBTS in your presentation, and someone wanted to know where it was available.
It's not available presently from us. Laura Hill has written a manual with Stephanie and Christine, and I think that's going to be published soon. So that's one way to learn more about it. And but I don't think it's out yet. And also our series of that we're going to put online in terms of videotape instruction and other kind of materials, isn't presently available. We hope to have that soon.
Okay. I feel so awful, everyone, because there's so many amazing questions in this chat, and we've just totally run out of time. So I truly apologize to all of you who wrote these great questions. Maybe we will find an opportunity somehow to get them answered. Unfortunately, not right now. So thank you so much, Dr. Kaye.
I can mention if you want to send me the questions, there's some way to post responses. Myself and my team would actually be very delighted to know what your questions are. We want to know what your concerns are, how you interpret this, what you're thinking, how we can help you. And if you want to send the questions to me, we can either post to Feast or post online. We'll get you some answers. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are.
Great. I really appreciate that because there are so many great questions here, and people really would love answers. So thank you. We can make it into a Feast blog. We have them in the chat. We're going to keep them. We'll send them to you. And whenever you and your staff gets a chance to answer them, we really appreciate it.
We want to work closely with Feast and continue this relationship and and be available. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for attending this webinar. Dr. Kaye, thank you so much. This was so incredibly informative and helpful for all the parents here. And everybody have a good morning, evening, afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.